Out here in the blood-red guts of the Texas Panhandle, the silence can kill you faster than a bullet. It gets in your head, makes you hear things. But what Eli Granger heard that evening wasn't in his head. It was real. It was a whimper. He'd been tracking a stray calf since sunrise, his bay mare tired beneath him, the sun a merciless hammer overhead. The trail had gone cold an hour ago, vanished into the rocky maw of Palo Duro Canyon. He was about to give it up, call the calf a donation to the coyotes. Then he heard it again, weak, human, and full of pain. His gut went cold, colder than a winter creek. A sound like that in a place like this? It meant trouble was either happening or it was about to. He swung down from his horse, the leather of his saddle groaning in protest. His rifle felt heavy and right as he pulled it from its scabbard. Every instinct, sharpened by years of hard living and harder losses, screamed at him. "Go back," they whispered. "This ain't your fight." But Eli had never been good at listening. He moved slow, boots silent in the rust-colored dust, weaving through the mesquite and sagebrush that clung to the canyon floor like stubborn weeds. The canyon walls rose up on either side of him, ancient and judging. The air grew thick, heavy with something more than just heat. It felt like a held breath. The sound led him to a clearing, dominated by a single gnarled cottonwood tree. Its branches clawed at the bruised purple sky like skeletal fingers. And from one of those fingers, a girl was hanging. She wasn't hanging by her neck. It was worse. Her wrists were bound to a low-hanging limb. Her arms stretched painfully above her head. Her body was limp, a rag doll given up to gravity, her bare feet dangling just inches from the ground. She was alive, barely. He could see the faint, shallow rise and fall of her chest. Eli's eyes, trained to spot a rattlesnake in the scrub at 50 paces, scanned every detail. The matted black hair hiding her face, the sun-darkened skin covered in a road map of bruises and dried blood. The raw, angry rope burns at her wrists. Whoever did this, they didn't just want her dead. They wanted her to suffer. Then his eyes snapped to the tree trunk, just above her head. A piece of wood, crudely nailed to the bark. Letters had been carved into it, deep and angry. "No mercy for redskins." The words hit Eli like a physical blow, knocking the wind from his lungs. Old ghosts, the ones he drank to forget, rose from their shallow graves. He scanned the rim of the canyon, every shadow, every crevice where a man with a rifle could be hiding. Nothing. The place was still as a tomb. Whoever did this was either long gone, or they were watching, waiting to see who'd be fool enough to take the bait. His hand went to the knife on his belt. He approached her slow, keeping his voice low and steady, the way you'd talk to a spooked horse. "Miss," he called out, "I ain't gonna hurt you." Her head lolled. A faint stir, nothing more. She looked young, maybe 19, but the frontier had a way of aging people fast. Her features under the grime were sharp and proud. Kiowa, he guessed. The high cheekbones, the set of her jaw. It was Kiowa raiders, they'd said. The ones who burned his ranch. The ones who took his wife, Nora. The ones who took his boy, Caleb. He had every reason in the world to hate the person hanging from that tree. Hate was easy out here. It was a currency everyone traded in. But mercy was a spring of clean water in a desert of blood. He looked at the sign again, then at the girl's fragile, broken form. "Ain't right," he muttered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. His knife flashed in the dying light, a sliver of silver against the deepening shadows. He sliced through the coarse rope. Her body sagged, a dead weight, but he was there to catch her before she hit the dirt. She was impossibly light, nothing but skin and bone, and she burned with a fever that felt hot enough to cook on. Her eyes fluttered open. For a second, just a second, they focused on him. They were dark, bottomless, and filled with a terror so profound it made his own bitter memories feel small. "Easy now," he murmured, laying her down gently. He pulled his canteen, wet a cloth, and pressed it to her cracked lips. She flinched but drank, a weak, desperate sound coming from her throat. Her hand, shaking like a leaf, grabbed onto the front of his shirt, clinging to it like it was the only solid thing in a world that had tried to tear her apart. "You're safe," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was lying. As he held her, his fingers brushed against something hard tucked into the waistband of her tattered leather skirt. It was small, wrapped in oilcloth. Instinctively, he pulled it free. It was a small, hand-carved wooden bird, its wings spread wide in flight. But it wasn't just a bird. Its edges were charred, blackened by fire. Before he could think on it, her eyes snapped open again, locking onto the bird in his hand. A different kind of fire lit up her gaze. Not fear, rage. She let out a guttural cry and lunged for it, her frail body filled with a sudden, impossible strength. She snatched the bird from his hand, clutching it to her chest like a shield. She stared at him, her chest heaving, her eyes no longer those of a victim. They were the eyes of a warrior. Eli Granger looked from the hate-filled sign on the tree to the fire in the girl's eyes, and a cold dread washed over him. He hadn't just saved a life. He had stepped into the middle of a war he didn't understand, and he had a terrible feeling he'd just picked the losing side. The ride back to his cabin was a slow, agonizing crawl through the dark. The girl, she still hadn't told him her name, was a feverish weight in front of him on the saddle. She'd gone limp again after her burst of anger. The little wooden bird still clutched tight in her hand. Every so often, a low moan would escape her lips, a sound that seemed to be ripped from the very soul of the canyon. His homestead wasn't much, just a weather-beaten shack pressed up against the canyon wall. More shadow than structure. It was a place a man came to be forgotten. Tonight, Eli wished it was a fortress. He carried her inside and laid her on his own cot. The flickering lantern light cast long, dancing shadow that made the small room feel like a cage. He worked in silence, cleaning her wounds, forcing sips of water between her cracked lips. Her wrists were raw, rubbed down to the meat. Bruises, old and new, painted her skin in ugly shades of purple and black. This wasn't just cruelty. This was personal. As he gently cleaned the grime from her face, he saw it. A faint blue tattoo at the corner of her right eye. A small, elegant symbol. He'd seen it before, years ago. It was the mark of a specific Kiowa family line. The keepers of stories. The guardians. Guardians of what? He glanced at the carved bird she refused to let go of, even in her fevered sleep. The pieces didn't fit, and Eli didn't like puzzles he couldn't solve. Puzzles out here got you killed. He settled into a chair by the hearth, his rifle across his lap. Sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford. Every gust of wind rattling the shutters sounded like footsteps. Every coyote howl sounded like a warning. He was a fool. A damn fool for getting involved. He should have ridden away, left her to her fate. It was the law of the canyon. You don't pick up snakes, even if they look like they're dying. Sometime before dawn, she started murmuring. Fever dreams. Words in a language he didn't understand, laced with panic. But then a few words of English cut through the haze, sharp and clear. Not the silver. It's a key, she thrashed, her hand tightening around the bird. Doyle. He can't have it. Eli's blood ran cold. Frank Doyle. The name was a foul taste in his mouth. Doyle wasn't law, but he acted like it. A rancher with a small army of hired guns who considered himself the judge, jury, and executioner of the Panhandle. He preached about purity and order, but everyone knew it was just an excuse for his own brand of violent greed. And his hate for the Kiowa was legendary. The girl's words tumbled out, faster now. But the Firebird, it opens the way. Firebird. Eli looked at the charred wooden bird in her fist. He just assumed it was burned in a raid. But what if the charring was deliberate? What if it was part of the design? He leaned closer, his curiosity overriding his caution. Gently, he tried to pry her fingers open to get a better look at the carving. Her eyes snapped open. They weren't glazed with fever anymore. They were clear, lucid, and filled with an icy calm that was more terrifying than her earlier fear. Her free hand moved like a snake, snatching a knife from a sheath hidden in her boot that he'd somehow missed. The blade was at his throat before he could even flinch. "Who are you?" she rasped, her voice a dry whisper of canyon dust and raw power. Eli froze, the cold steel pressing against his skin. He saw his own reflection in her dark, unblinking eyes. He didn't see a savior. He saw a threat. He saw another white man trying to take something that wasn't his. "My name's Eli Granger," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "And I'm the man who cut you down from that tree." Her eyes narrowed. The knife didn't waver. "Why?" It was a simple question, but the answer was anything but. He could tell her about his wife and son. He could tell her about the Kiowa raid that had left him a hollowed-out shell of a man. He could tell her that seeing her hanging there, he didn't see an enemy. He just saw a person who didn't deserve to die like that. But he didn't. He gave her the only truth that mattered in that moment. "Because whoever Frank Doyle is," he said, his gaze locked on hers, "I figure any man he wants dead is a man I ought to help." For a long moment, the only sounds were the crackling fire and their own ragged breaths. The knife stayed at his throat, a razor-thin line between life and death. He could see the conflict warring in her eyes. Years of betrayal fighting against a flicker of desperate hope. Slowly, agonizingly, the pressure of the blade lessened. She pulled the knife back but kept it ready. "My name is Naira," she said, her voice hard as rock. "And you have no idea the trouble you've just brought to your door." Eli let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He looked at the determined girl, the hidden knife, the mysterious firebird, and the storm he knew was coming for them. "Lady," he said with a grim smile, "trouble's been living here for years. It might as well have a little company." Morning came, painting the canyon in shades of gray and suspicion. A tense, unspoken truce settled over the cabin. Nara didn't thank him, and Eli didn't ask for it. Thanks were a form of debt, and neither of them could afford to owe the other anything. She moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, despite the pain that clearly racked her body. She ate the jerky he offered, her eyes constantly flicking to the door, to the windows, listening for a sound that was still miles away, but getting closer with every tick of the clock. "Doyle," Eli said, breaking the silence. "You said his name." Naira's jaw tightened. She held the firebird in her lap, her thumb tracing its charred wings. "He wants this," she said, her voice low. "He thinks it leads to silver." "Does it?" A bitter smile touched her lips. "White men always think everything leads to silver, or gold, or something they can dig out of the ground and own. They are like children grabbing at shiny rocks." She looked at him, her gaze sharp, assessing. "It is a key. It leads to a place my people must reach before the next full moon, a place of sanctuary." Before Eli could ask more, his mare snorted outside, a sharp, nervous sound. He was on his feet in an instant, rifle in hand, his body moving on pure instinct. He peered through a crack in the shutters. Dust, a cloud of it on the northern ridge. 3 riders, moving fast. "They're here," he said, his voice flat. Naira was already moving, her face a mask of grim determination. She grabbed the small pack of supplies he'd set aside, her knife back in its sheath. There was no panic in her, only a cold, focused energy. "There's a path behind the cabin," Eli said quickly, "leads up into the rocks. It's steep, but it'll give you cover." She looked at him, a question in her eyes. "You're not coming?" Eli gave a humorless laugh. "Someone's got to slow him down. Besides, this is my home. I ain't keen on just handing it over." It was a lie. This shack wasn't a home. It was a tomb filled with ghosts. But he'd be damned if he let Doyle and his scum desecrate it. "Go," he ordered. "When it's clear, head south. Don't stop." She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her dark eyes searching his. Then she nodded, a swift, sharp movement. "The spirits watch over the brave," she whispered, and then she was gone, slipping out the back door like a ghost. Eli turned his attention back to the riders. They were closer now. He could make out the lead man, Frank Doyle, big, barrel-chested, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and then beaten with a hammer. The 2 men with him were lean, hungry-looking wolves, the kind that kill for sport. He took a deep breath, the familiar smell of gunpowder and old wood filling his lungs. He felt a strange calm settle over him. He hadn't felt this alive, this purposeful, since the day he'd buried his family. Doyle and his men reined in their horses 100 yards from the cabin, their rifles held at the ready. "Granger!" Doyle's voice boomed across the clearing, a sound like rocks grinding together. "I know you're in there, and I know you've got something that belongs to me." Eli remained silent, his own rifle resting on the windowsill, his sight trained on Doyle's chest. "There's a bounty on that Kiowa girl," Doyle shouted. "Murder. Killed a ranch hand. Turn her over and I might just forget you harbored a fugitive." Murder. Eli knew it was a lie, the kind of lie men like Doyle told to make their greed sound like justice. "Last chance, Granger." Eli's thumb clicked the hammer back. The sound was deafening in the small cabin. He wasn't just fighting for Naira anymore. He was fighting for the memory of Nora and Caleb. He was fighting against the sickness that men like Doyle spread across the land. The sickness of hate that had taken everything from him. "You want her," Eli called out, his voice ringing with a cold fury he hadn't felt in years. "You gotta come through me." Doyle laughed, a nasty, grating sound. "Have it your way, old man." He raised his hand, a signal to his men. But before he could drop it, a fourth rider appeared on the ridge. The rider was moving at a full gallop, his horse kicking up a plume of dust. He was dressed in the faded blue of the cavalry, but he rode with a wildness that didn't belong to any army. As he got closer, Eli's heart lurched in his chest. He knew that rider, Jedediah Stone, an old friend, a man he'd ridden with years ago, a man he'd thought was long dead. Jed reined his horse to a dramatic stop between Doyle and the cabin, creating a line in the sand. "Stand down, Doyle," Jed yelled, his voice carrying a surprising authority. "This is official U.S. Army business now. That girl is a wanted fugitive of the state. She's my prisoner." Doyle stared, his face a thundercloud of confusion and rage. Eli was just as stunned. What in God's name was Jed doing here? Jed turned in his saddle, his eyes finding the cabin window where Eli was hiding. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. A nod that said, "I'm here to help. Trust me." But as Eli looked closer, he saw something that made the blood freeze in his veins. Tucked into Jed's belt, gleaming in the morning sun, was a small, hand-carved wooden bird. Its wings were spread wide, and its edges were charred, just like Naira's. It wasn't a rescue. It was a trap. Jed wasn't here to save them. He was here for the same thing Doyle was. And Eli was caught right in the middle. The world seemed to shrink down to the space between the three men outside his cabin. Doyle, snarling and confused. Jedediah playing the part of the lawman. And Eli, a ghost from the past who suddenly found himself the warden of a secret he was only just beginning to understand. "Army business?" Doyle spat, his hand never straying far from the pistol at his hip. "Since when does the Army send one man to do its dirty work, Jedediah? I thought you were a tracker, not a soldier." "Times change, Frank," Jed said, his voice smooth as polished stone. He swung down from his horse, moving with a confident swagger that set Eli's teeth on edge. "There's a new marshal in Amarillo. He doesn't approve of freelance justice. He wants the girl brought in alive. For trial. It was a good story, believable even. But the sight of that second Firebird burned in Eli's mind. There were two of them. Two keys. What in hell did they open? "Now, I know she's in there with Granger," Jed continued, turning his back on Doyle to address the cabin directly. A risky move, unless he was absolutely certain Doyle wouldn't shoot him. "Eli, it's me, Jed. I know you're in there. Don't do anything foolish. This is all a misunderstanding. Just send the girl out." Eli's mind raced. Naira was in the rocks behind the cabin, but she couldn't have gotten far. If he started a firefight now, they'd be pinned down. She'd be trapped. He had to play along. He had to buy her time. "Jed," Eli called out, pitching his voice with feigned disbelief. "Jedediah Stone? I thought a Comanche arrow took you down years ago." A wide grin split Jed's face. "It takes more than that to kill me, old friend. Now listen, I'm here to help you. Doyle's got a mob worked up. They think this girl is some kind of demon. I can get you both out of this, but you have to trust me." "Trust him." The words were a bitter joke. Eli looked past Jed to Doyle. The big man was seething, but he was holding back. "Jed, somehow, had power over him. It wasn't the authority of a badge. It was something else. Then Eli understood. They weren't rivals. They were partners. A classic two-man con. Doyle was the muscle, the scary face to intimidate and bully. Jed was the reasonable one, the voice of false hope you'd turn to for help. They were working together to flush Naira out. "All right, Jed," Eli shouted, trying to sound relieved. "Hold your fire. I'm coming out. The girl, she's hurt bad. I'll need a hand with her." He saw Jed relax, a flicker of triumph in his eyes. "Attaboy, Eli. Knew you'd see sense." Eli took a deep breath. This was a long shot, the kind that usually ended with a shallow grave. He grabbed a spare blanket and stuffed it with rags from his wood box, creating a crude, body-shaped bundle. He slung his rifle over his back and picked up the bundle, cradling it in his arms like it was a person. He kicked the door open and stepped out into the blinding sunlight, squinting as if his eyes were adjusting. He kept his head down, his movements slow and deliberate, playing the part of a defeated man. "She's passed out," Eli said, his voice rough. "Fever's high." Jed took a step forward, his hand outstretched. "Easy now, Eli. Let's just get her on my horse. We'll get her to a doctor in town." Doyle and his men watched, their rifles still raised but their posture slightly relaxed. They thought they'd won. Eli kept walking, shuffling his feet in the dust, getting closer and closer to Jed. 10 feet, 5 feet. "She's lighter than she looks," Eli grunted. "Barely skin and bones." He was 3 feet away now. He could smell the sweat and leather on Jed. He could see the greed in his eyes. "Just give her to me," Jed started to say. That's when Eli moved. In one fluid motion, he dropped the fake bundle and his hand shot to the revolver at his hip. The move was a blur, muscle memory from 100 saloon brawls and cattle drive shootouts. He'd drawn, cocked, and fired before Jed even had time to process the betrayal. The shot wasn't aimed to kill. It was aimed at the dust at Jed's feet. The explosion of sound and dirt made Jed leap back, his face a mask of shock. At the same instant, Eli dove to the side, rolling behind a rusted-out water trough that offered pathetic but necessary cover. Doyle's men opened fire, bullets splintering the cabin door and thudding into the trough. The air filled with the roar of gunpowder. "It was a trick," Doyle bellowed. "He let her go. Find her." One of Doyle's men spurred his horse, galloping toward the back of the cabin, straight for the path Naira had taken. Eli knew he only had one shot. He rose up from behind the trough, ignoring the bullets whining past his head. He took aim at the rider, leading him by a foot, and squeezed the trigger. The rider jerked in the saddle, cried out, and tumbled to the ground. But the moment of triumph was short-lived. A searing pain exploded in Eli's left shoulder. He staggered back, his arm going numb. Jed! He'd been hit. He dropped back behind the trough, gasping, the metallic taste of his own blood filling his mouth. He was pinned down, wounded, and he had just sent Doyle's men directly to Naira's hiding place. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard Jed's voice, cold and furious. "You stubborn old fool, Granger. You have no idea what you're messing with. That ain't just some Kiowa girl, and this ain't about a bounty." Doyle's remaining man was dismounting, moving cautiously towards the rocks behind the cabin. Jed and Doyle were advancing on his position, using the cover of his own porch. He was trapped. Just as he thought it was over, a high, piercing cry echoed from the rocks above. It was a sound that was part bird, part human. A war cry that chilled him to the bone. Doyle's man, the one hunting for Naira, suddenly screamed. It was a short, sharp sound, cut off abruptly. Then silence. Jed and Doyle froze, their eyes snapping toward the rocky path. Eli risked a look over the trough. He could see Doyle's man lying on the ground at the base of the trail. His own knife was sticking out of his chest. And standing on a ledge 20 feet above him was Naira. She wasn't a scared, broken girl anymore. Her face was streaked with dirt and fury. In her hand, she held the man's rifle. She worked the lever action with a practiced, deadly efficiency that made it clear she'd used one before. She wasn't a guardian of stories. She was a guardian of a different sort. She fired a shot, not at Doyle or Jed, but at the hitching post where their horses were tied. The wood exploded into splinters. The horses screamed in terror, reared up, and bolted, galloping off into the canyon. Their escape was gone. Nara locked eyes with Eli across the clearing. A silent message passed between them. Now we fight. The tables had just turned. It was still 2 against 2. But they were wounded, trapped, and on foot. And the desert was a long way to walk. The standoff stretched, tight as a noose. The sun beat down, turning the clearing into an oven. Eli's shoulder throbbed in time with his heartbeat, a hot, wet fire spreading across his back. He pressed a hand to the wound, the blood slick and warm between his fingers. "You've made your last mistake, Granger," Doyle yelled from the cover of the porch. "You should have stayed a ghost." Jed's voice cut in, smoother, more dangerous. "This doesn't have to end with more blood, Eli. We just want the keys. There's 2 of them. The girl has one, I have the other. Together they open the Spanish vault in the Serpent's Tooth Mountain. Gold, Eli, more than you've ever dreamed of." So that was it. Not silver, Spanish gold. A legend whispered around campfires, a myth that had driven men mad for centuries. And Naira's people were the protectors. The Firebirds weren't just keys, they were a sacred trust. "She's not giving you anything," Eli shouted back, his voice strained. He risked a glance up at the ledge. Naira was gone. She'd moved, using the terrain to her advantage. Smart, he had an idea. A terrible, desperate idea. "You want a key so bad, Jed?" Eli yelled. "Come and get it." He knew he was bluffing. He didn't have her Firebird, but they didn't know that. It was enough to plant a seed of doubt, to split their focus. He heard them muttering on the porch, arguing. That was what he needed. A moment's confusion. He looked around his meager cover, the water trough, a pile of old firewood, and beyond that, the lean-to barn where he kept his stubborn old mule and 2 goats. The barn was flimsy, but it offered a new angle, a way to flank them. It was 50 feet of open ground away, a suicide run. He took a deep breath, the pain in his shoulder making him dizzy. He thought of Nora. He thought of Caleb. He thought of the fire in Naira's eyes. He wasn't going to die cowering behind a water trough. He burst from cover, running low and fast, his boots kicking up clouds of red dust. 2 shots rang out instantly. One whizzed past his ear. The other ripped through the fleshy part of his thigh. His leg buckled, and he went down hard, crying out in pain. He scrambled the last few feet on his hands and knees, bullets kicking up dirt all around him, and collapsed behind the relative safety of the barn wall. He was in a bad way, bleeding from 2 places now, his vision starting to swim at the edges. He was a fool. His desperate plan had failed. He slumped against the rough wood, his revolver slipping from his numb fingers. This was it. This was how it ended. Alone, bleeding out in the dirt for a girl whose name he'd only known for a day. He heard footsteps approaching. Slow, cautious, Jed and Doyle coming to finish the job. He closed his eyes, waiting for the final shot. Instead, he heard a goat bleat. A loud panic sound. Then a crash. He forced his eyes open. Doyle had kicked in the flimsy barn door, his massive frame silhouetted against the bright light. He stepped inside, his rifle leveled, a cruel grin on his face. "Nowhere left to run, old man," Doyle snarled. But Doyle had made a mistake. He was so focused on Eli, he didn't look up. From the hayloft above, a shadow detached itself from the darkness. Naira dropped down, silent as an owl, landing directly on Doyle's broad back. The big man roared in surprise and pain as her knife, the one she'd held to Eli's throat, plunged deep into his shoulder, the same shoulder where Eli had been shot. A rough sort of justice. Doyle thrashed wildly, trying to throw her off, but she clung to him like a burr, her legs wrapped around his waist. He stumbled backward, out of the barn and into the sunlight, roaring like a wounded bear. Jed, who had been circling around the other side, stared in disbelief. This was Eli's chance, his only chance. Ignoring the fire in his leg and shoulder, he lunged for his revolver. His fingers closed around the grip. He propped himself up against the barn wall, his body screaming in protest. He took aim at Jed, but Jed was fast. He saw the move, saw Doyle struggling, and made a choice. He wasn't going to fight a wounded old man and a wildcat Kiowa girl. Not when he had what he wanted. He turned and ran. Not toward the canyon, but toward the open plains. He was abandoning his partner, leaving Doyle to die. Eli squeezed the trigger. The hammer clicked on an empty chamber. He'd fired his last shot. He watched helplessly as Jed scrambled away, getting smaller and smaller, a black figure against the vast, unforgiving landscape. Doyle, meanwhile, finally managed to rip Naira off his back, sending her sprawling into the dust. He raised his rifle to bring the stock down on her head, his face a mask of pure hate. Eli screamed, a raw, wordless sound of fury. He threw his empty revolver with all his might. It was a pathetic, useless gesture, but it was all he had left. The heavy gun spun through the air and struck Doyle square in the side of the head. It wasn't enough to knock him out, but it stunned him for a critical second. His rifle shot went wide, blasting a hole in the dirt next to Naira's head. That second was all she needed. She rolled, came up in a crouch, and launched herself forward, not with her knife, but with her hands. She drove the heel of her palm up under Doyle's chin. His head snapped back with a sickening crack. His eyes went wide with surprise, and then they went glassy and empty. He crumpled to the ground like a sack of grain, landing in a heap at her feet. Silence descended on the clearing, broken only by the panicked bleating of the goats and Eli's own ragged gasps. Naira stood over Doyle's body, her chest heaving. She looked at Eli, her dark eyes wide with the shock of what had just happened. They were alive. Against all odds, they were alive. But Jed was gone. He was gone, and he had one of the keys, and he would not stop until he had the other one. The battle for the cabin was over, but the war for the Firebird had just begun. The aftermath was a grim, quiet affair. The Texas sun showed no pity, beating down on the dead and the wounded alike. Naira moved with an eerie efficiency, her earlier ferocity replaced by a solemn purpose. She retrieved her knife from Doyle's shoulder, wiping it clean in the dust without a flicker of emotion. She came to Eli, her shadow falling over him. He was leaning against the barn, trying to keep pressure on his leg, a wave of dizziness washing over him. Without a word, she knelt beside him. She ripped strips from the shirt of the dead man by the trail and began to bind his wounds. Her hands were surprisingly gentle but firm, her movements practiced. She'd done this before, too many times. "He got away," Eli rasped, the words tasting like failure. "Jed." "I saw," she said, her voice flat. She finished tying a tight knot on his shoulder bandage. "He will go to the Serpent's Tooth. He will wait for me." "He has one of the keys," Eli said. "Can he get in with just one?" She shook her head, her eyes dark with a history he could only guess at. "No. Both Firebirds must be placed together, one in the light of the rising sun, one in the light of the setting sun. Only then does the way open. It is a door that can only be opened at dawn or dusk." She looked toward the southern mountains, barely visible on the horizon. "And it can only be opened on the night of the harvest moon, 3 weeks from now." 3 weeks, to cross 100 miles of hostile territory, wounded on foot while being hunted. The odds weren't just long, they were impossible. "We need horses," Eli said, stating the obvious. Naira's gaze fell upon his old, stubborn mule, which was now cautiously sniffing Doyle's body. "We have one," she corrected. It took them the better part of an hour to prepare. Naira found a full canteen and a bag of jerky on one of the dead men. She took their ammunition. Eli, leaning heavily on a rifle used as a crutch, managed to rig a travois, a simple sledge made of 2 long poles and a blanket, to be pulled by the mule. He knew he wouldn't be able to ride for long. The plan was for him to lie on the travois while Naira rode the mule, leading them south. It was a pathetic caravan for a journey so desperate. As she loaded their meager supplies, Eli's gaze fell on the sign still nailed to the cottonwood tree where he'd found her. "No mercy for red skins." He limped over to it, his legs screaming with every step. With a grunt of effort, he ripped it from the tree, the rusty nails groaning in protest. He snapped the hateful piece of wood over his knee and tossed the pieces into the dust. It didn't change anything, but it felt right. He turned back to see Naira watching him, an unreadable expression on her face. "My family," she said suddenly, her voice barely a whisper. "They were guardians, for generations. When the soldiers came, my father gave me one Firebird. He kept the other." He told me to run, to meet our cousins at the sanctuary. He said he would hold them off. Her voice cracked, but she didn't weep. Her grief was too old for tears. The soldiers, they were led by a tracker, a white man who knew our ways. He helped them hunt us. Eli's gut clenched. Jedediah, she nodded. He killed my father, but he only found one of the keys. He has been hunting me for the other ever since. Doyle and his men, they were just greedy fools. Jed used to flush me out. Now it all made sense. The bounty for murder was a lie to get local muscle involved. Jed never wanted her dead. He needed her alive, needed her to lead him to the second key. He thinks I have it, Naira said, touching the small leather pouch at her belt where she kept the Firebird. He doesn't know that I know where he is going. A cold, hard plan began to form in Eli's mind. A plan born of desperation and a thirst for a justice he'd long since given up on. He's not just hunting you anymore, Eli said, his voice low and gravelly. He was there, the day my ranch burned, the day they... He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The look in Naira's eyes was one of profound understanding. Their tragedies, born from the same man's greed, were now intertwined. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was theirs. We go south, Eli said, his jaw set. But we don't run. We hunt. They left the cabin and the bodies to the sun and the vultures. Naira rode the mule, her back straight and proud, the lead rope for the travois in her hand. Eli lay on the rough blanket, his rifle by his side, the unforgiving land sliding past him. Every jolt was agony. The sun was a relentless enemy. Thirst became a constant companion. For days they traveled in a haze of pain and grim determination. Naira was tireless. She found water in places that looked barren. She read the tracks in the sand, keeping them off the main trails, moving through the canyons and arroyos like a spirit of the land. She cared for his wounds, sharing her own meager rations without complaint. In the cold desert nights, they huddled together for warmth by a small, smokeless fire, the vast canopy of stars their only witness. They spoke little, but a bond was being forged between them, stronger than steel, tempered in blood and shared loss. One night, as he lay staring at the fire, the pain in his leg a dull, constant roar, he finally asked the question that had been nagging at him. "Why?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Why didn't you just leave me? You would have moved faster alone." She looked at him from across the fire, her face illuminated by the soft glow. Her expression was serious, her dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "My father taught me that a debt of life is the most sacred bond," she said softly. "You saved me from the tree. My life is yours until that debt is paid." Eli shook his head. "I don't want you to owe me anything." A faint smile touched her lips. "It is not about what you want. It is the way of my people." She paused, then added, "And besides, you fight well for an old wounded white man." Despite the pain, Eli felt a genuine laugh bubble up in his chest. It was a rusty, unused sound, but it was real. As the days bled into weeks, his strength slowly returned. Soon he was able to walk for short periods, then for longer. Eventually he could ride the mule while Naira walked ahead, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon. They were a team, a broken, battered, but determined team. They were less than a week from the Serpent's Tooth when they found the tracks. 3 horses. One of them was shod in a way Eli recognized. A cavalry shoe, but with a distinctive nick in the heel. It was Jed's horse. He wasn't alone anymore. He'd found himself new partners. "He's not waiting for us at the mountain," Naira said, her voice tight with concern. "He's coming back for us. He knows we're too slow." Eli looked at the tracks, then at the rugged landscape ahead. Jed was coming to finish it, to take the final key and leave them for dead in the desert. There would be no more running. The final battle would be here, in these rocks, on ground of Jed's choosing. "Let him come," Eli said, a cold fire in his eyes. "This time, we'll be ready." They found their spot in a narrow box canyon. The walls were sheer, climbable in only a few places. The entrance was a bottleneck, a perfect kill zone. But the back of the canyon offered a slim, treacherous trail leading up and out. It was a trap, but it was a trap with a back door. "We make our stand here," Eli said, his voice echoing slightly in the enclosed space. When they ride in, we hit them from above. Naira nodded, her face set. For 2 days they prepared. They hauled rocks to the top of the canyon rim, creating small avalanches they could trigger. They found positions that offered cover and a clear line of fire. They ate the last of their jerky and drank sparingly from their canteens, conserving their strength. The waiting was the hardest part. The silence of the desert pressed in, filled with the ghosts of their past and the uncertainty of their future. Eli found his thoughts drifting to Nora and Caleb, not with the sharp, stabbing pain he was used to, but with a quiet, sorrowful resolve. He was doing this for them. He was going to finish the story they never could. On the third day they came, 3 riders silhouetted against the morning sun. Jed was in the lead. The 2 men with him were hard cases, mercenaries by the look of them, the kind of men who would sell their own mother for a bottle of whiskey and a gold coin. They paused at the mouth of the canyon, cautious. "You think they're in there?" one of the men asked, his voice drifting on the still air. "This is the only water for 20 miles, Jed replied. "They're in here. Granger's wounded. They can't have gone far. Spread out. Flush them out. I want the girl alive. The old man, he's disposable." Eli and Naira exchanged a look from their perch high on the canyon wall. They were hidden behind a cluster of boulders, their rifles resting on the stone. The 3 men entered the canyon, their horses picking their way nervously through the rocks. They separated, moving along the canyon floor, their eyes scanning the walls. "Now," Eli whispered. Naira pushed with all her might against the pile of rocks they had assembled. The small avalanche started slowly, then gained momentum, a river of stone and dust crashing down into the canyon. It didn't hit any of the men directly, but it did exactly what they intended. It sent their horses into a panic. One of the mercenaries was thrown, his horse bolting down the canyon. The other man barely kept control of his spooked mount. In that moment of chaos, Eli and Naira opened fire. Eli's first shot took the thrown mercenary in the chest. The man crumpled without a sound. Naira's shot was just as true, hitting the second man's horse. The animal screamed and went down, pinning the rider's leg underneath it. It was 2 against 1. Jed, he was good. Eli had to give him that. The moment the rocks fell, Jed had thrown himself from his horse, finding cover behind a large boulder before the first shots were even fired. He returned fire, his bullets sparking off the rocks near their heads, forcing them to stay down. "You can't win, Eli," Jed screamed, his voice filled with rage. "I should have left you to rot in that desert years ago." "You should have," Eli roared back. "But you got greedy. You murdered my family for a map, for a ghost story." A bitter laugh echoed through the canyon. "It was never about the map, you fool. Your wife, Nora, she was a scholar. She wasn't just looking at legends. She had found a Spanish missionary's journal. Proof. She was going to report it to the army, have the whole area declared a historical site. Protected. She was going to ruin everything. The raid, it was just to shut her up. The Kiowa were just a convenient excuse." The truth, when it finally came, was a cold, ugly thing. It settled in Eli's chest like a block of ice. It wasn't random. It wasn't war. It was murder, plain and simple. Cold-blooded and calculated. A primal rage, purer and hotter than any he had ever felt, washed over him. He stood up from behind his cover, ignoring Naira's warning cry. He stood there in full view, his rifle at his hip. "Come on, Jedediah," he bellowed, his voice raw with grief and fury. "One last ride. For Nora." He opened fire, working the lever action of his rifle, sending a hail of bullets toward Jed's position. It was reckless. It was foolish. But it was all he had left. Jed, seeing his chance, broke cover, firing as he ran. A bullet tore through Eli's side, spinning him around. He staggered, but he didn't fall. He brought his rifle back up, his vision blurring, and fired one last time. The shot caught Jed in the leg. He cried out and went down, his rifle skittering across the rocks. At the same time, the mercenary trapped under his horse finally managed to free his pistol. He took aim at the exposed Eli. "Eli!" Naira screamed. She leaped from their perch, landing on a ledge 10 feet below, then scrambled down the rock face with the agility of a mountain goat. She moved with impossible speed, a blur of motion. She reached the canyon floor just as the mercenary fired. She threw herself at Eli, pushing him out of the way. The bullet, meant for his heart, took her high in the shoulder. She cried out in pain and collapsed beside him. The mercenary, a grim smile on his face, cocked his pistol for the finishing shot. But he never got to take it. A shadow fell over him. Eli, bleeding from a fresh wound, his face a mask of terrible fury, stood over the man. He no longer had his rifle. He held only a rock, a heavy, jagged rock. He brought it down once, twice. Then he walked, stumbling, over to where Jed was trying to crawl away. He kicked Jed's pistol out of his reach. He stood over his former friend, his chest heaving, blood dripping from his side onto the dry desert sand. Jed looked up at him, his face a mixture of fear and defiance. "You're going to kill me, Eli," he sneered, coughing up blood. "After all this, you don't have it in you." Eli looked down at the man who had destroyed his life. He saw the face of the man who had killed his wife, his son. He felt the hatred coiling in his gut, demanding vengeance. He raised the rock. Then he looked over at Naira, who was pushing herself up, her hand pressed to her bleeding shoulder, her eyes pleading with him. He looked at the rock in his hand. He looked at Jed's pathetic, bleeding form, and he saw that Jed was wrong. Killing him would be an ending, but it wouldn't be justice. Justice wasn't for him to give. He let the rock fall from his hand. "No," Eli said, his voice a low growl. "I'm not going to kill you." He bent down and picked up Jed's canteen. He opened it and poured all the water out onto the sand, watching it disappear into the thirsty earth. He did the same with the other men's canteens. He then took Jed's Firebird key from his belt. "The nearest town is a 50-mile walk back the way you came," Eli said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "If you make it, you can tell the law what happened here. If you don't, well, the desert doesn't show mercy." He turned his back on Jedediah Stone and walked over to Naira, helping her to her feet. Leaning on each other, bleeding and broken, they began the slow, painful journey to the back of the canyon, to the trail that led up and out. Behind them, Jed's curses and pleas echoed against the stone walls, until they were finally swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the desert. Justice had been served, not with a bullet, but with a choice. The Serpent's Tooth Mountain loomed before them, its twin peaks like fangs biting at the sky. The final leg of their journey had taken everything they had left. They were walking wounded, ghosts haunted by the battle in the canyon, but they were alive, and they were together. They reached the base of the mountain as the sun began its descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and blood. According to Naira's story, the entrance to the vault was hidden on a ledge between the two peaks, a place that would catch the last rays of the setting sun. The climb was treacherous. Every handhold was a struggle, every foothold a prayer. Eli's wounds had reopened, and his body screamed in protest. But Naira's quiet strength urged him on. She moved with a grim determination, her own pain ignored in service of their goal. They found the ledge just as the sun touched the horizon. It was a narrow shelf of rock, and set into the cliff face was a smooth circular stone door, covered in carvings too ancient to be understood. In the center of the door were two depressions, shaped like birds in flight. "We are here," Naira whispered, her voice filled with a reverence that transcended her exhaustion. She pulled her Firebird from its leather pouch. Its charred wood seemed to absorb the fading light. Eli held out the one he had taken from Jed. "Together," she said. They each took a step forward and placed the wooden keys into the depressions. One faced east toward the memory of the dawn. The other faced west toward the dying of the light. For a moment nothing happened. Then, as the very last sliver of the sun dipped below the horizon, a low grinding sound echoed from deep within the mountain. The stone door, impossibly heavy, began to recede into the cliff face, revealing a dark, cavernous opening. A cool, ancient air, smelling of dust and time, washed over them. Eli expected to see treasure, piles of Spanish gold, chests overflowing with jewels. But the chamber was empty, almost. In the center of the dusty floor, there was no gold, no silver. There was a spring, a small, clear pool of water, bubbling up from the heart of the mountain. The walls of the cavern were not bare rock. They were covered in paintings, generation upon generation of Kiowa history, telling the story of their people, their triumphs, their sorrows, their connection to the land. This wasn't a vault of treasure. It was a library, a sanctuary, a place of life and memory. The Spanish sought gold, Naira said softly, a tired but profound smile on her face. They never understood. The greatest treasure is water. The greatest wealth is our story. This place, it is the heart of our people. The place we come to remember who we are, so we are never lost. She knelt by the spring and cupped her hands, drinking deeply. She splashed the cool, clean water on her wounds and on his. It felt like a baptism, a washing away of the blood and the hate. Eli stood there, humbled. He had fought and bled for a child's legend of gold, only to find something infinitely more precious. He understood now what Naira's family had died to protect. It wasn't a thing to be owned, but a legacy to be preserved. They stayed in the cavern that night, sheltered from the wind, the story of a people watching over them. They were safe. The harvest moon rose, full and bright, its light unable to penetrate their sanctuary. The door would remain open until dawn. In the quiet dark, Naira turned to him. "The debt is paid, Eli Granger. You brought me home. You are free to go." Eli looked at the entrance, at the star-dusted sky beyond. He could leave. He could ride north, try to find a new place to be forgotten, a new ghost to become, or he could stay. He thought of his empty cabin, his empty life. He thought of the fire in Naira's eyes, of the bond forged between them in the crucible of the desert. He was tired of being a ghost. "What if I don't want to go?" he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. "My story, it ended a long time ago. But yours, I'd like to see how it turns out." Naira's expression softened. She reached out and took his calloused hand in hers. Her touch was warm, solid, real. "Then a new story begins," she whispered. When the dawn came, they did not leave. They watched as the first rays of sun hit the entrance, and the great stone door slowly ground its way shut, sealing them inside. It would not open again until the next harvest moon. But they were not prisoners. They were home, in the heart of the mountain, with the stories of the past and the promise of a future. A broken old rancher and a fierce Kiowa warrior began to heal. Together. They had enough supplies to last, and a spring of pure water. They had time. Out in the desert, the sun rose on a new day. The wind blew across the plains, covering the tracks of their enemies, slowly erasing the scars on the land. The world outside would continue its violent, greedy dance. But here, in the quiet sanctuary of the serpent's tooth, a new life, born from impossible odds, was about to begin. They had found the only treasure that ever truly mattered: peace. If this story of survival, justice, and the discovery of true treasure kept you on the edge of your seat, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. And drop a comment below letting me know what you would have done in Eli's shoes. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.